Attending today's webinar, 6 Critical Factors for a Successful Commercial Launch Strategy, presented by Metadata Acorn AI. I'm Liz Wesky, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Frank Lane, Vice President, Commercial Data Solutions, Metadata Acorn AI, Joe Shanke, Customer Success Lead, Commercial Data Solutions, Metadata Acorn AI, Vinny Marino, Senior Director, Delivery Excellence, Commercial Data Solutions, Metadata Acorn AI. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure that your volume is all the way up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Frank, please go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. Again, I'm Frank Lane. As we get started today, I just wanted to provide a little background on our perspective on commercial launch. It's based on our experience providing data management, insights, and analytics solutions for commercial across a wide variety of brands. The brands span the life cycle, including development, pre-commercial planning, launch, and mature brand phases. Our services have covered a broad set of commercial activities, including sales, marketing, market access, patient services, and a number of other programs. And in addition, our solutions cover both primary care and specialty therapeutic areas where the patient journey, distribution, reimbursement, dosing, and administration differ significantly. The 6 critical keys for a successful launch take into account our direct experience supporting nearly 100 brands. And in addition, in many cases, we've collected some secondary research to provide backings for our findings and recommendations. Today, what we will cover are the 6 factors. Factor 1, start the planning process early and with the right funding. Factor 2, leverage a cross-functional team that spans clinical, medical, and commercial functions. Factor 3, identify the right KPIs to measure performance. Factor 4, build a launch roadmap with the best data and insights. Factor 5, track performance and constantly adapt. And Factor 6 is choose the right data and analytics partner that provides the requisite capabilities and allows for the inherent flexibility required for launch. We have experience supporting launches from emerging and established biopharmas. Whereas 10 to 20 years ago, an emerging organization needed to partner with an established pharma for commercialization. Today, the trend is the opposite. In fact, over the next 5 years, 56% of blockbuster products are expected to be launched by first-time launchers. And unfortunately, if today's trends hold true, nearly half of those products will fail to meet pre-launch sales forecasts. In addition, our research shows that adjusted for indication approvals, the first 6 months is critical to the overall brand success. As we look at some trends in the marketplace, we looked at the financial world as a measure to get some objective information. And in the first half of 2021, there's been an increase in capital of $400 billion. $30 billion of that has come in private placements through VC and private equity investments in your development phase and early commercial phase organizations. We've seen $380 billion in market capitalization increases in the public markets. That's across 61 IPOs, and that number balloons up to 94 IPOs when we include healthcare organizations. And the other big bulk of that $380 billion growth is around market cap growth. An extreme example here of Moderna, in January 2020, Moderna was valued at about $6.5 billion. and earlier this year it reached close to $150 billion. So the financial markets provide this backdrop of all of the capital that's going into development and commercialization of these products. And we also see through the successes of, again, companies like Moderna and similar companies, the incentive for being able to commercialize the drug independently. The trend that we see today is that 3 times the number of products are being launched by first-time launchers as compared to 10 years ago. And there's some factors here that are really driving this from the pharmaco side of the world. Quite honestly, I've been very impressed with the talent, experience, and expertise of the teams that are leading launches at emerging companies. However, these teams are lean and rely on a growing number of specialized partners to provide services. This can include patient services hubs, distribution, sample management, and other important programs and functions. And these vendors are providing these services in a way that's much akin to a large pharmaco having different departments to provide these functions. However, there is a laser-like focus coming out of these organizations. Knowing that they have less headcount, there's a crystal clear focus on developing the right KPIs and metrics to measure and manage performance and to ensure that the commercial model is working appropriately. So, as we start off this, we talk about how difficult it is to reach peak year sales, and start off by saying that half of companies failed to reach that pre-launch forecast. However, the counterpoint to that is that half of these companies will meet their pre-launch forecast. Now, of the successful brands, there's a commonality. They invested earlier and they invested appropriately. You might be thinking, when should I invest and how much? Well, our review shows that in the 2 years leading up to launch, companies that invested 75% of their peak year sales forecast invested that money into their SG&A functions. 73% of those companies hit their forecasts. If the company failed to invest 75% of their launch year forecast in SG&A, none of those companies reached their pre-sales forecast. So there's a pretty binary story here: invest early and invest the right amount. That concludes the first key to success. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Frank. The next key factor is applying a cross-functional strategy as you build your commercial model. Let's break this down. There are 3 key elements that define commercial success for a life sciences organization. They are finding patients, getting those patients on therapy, and maximizing treatment adherence. This is how you're going to add value for your patients and how you ultimately will drive revenue for your organization. In the real world, you're going to have a limited number of patients with relevant disease, condition, etc. So you're going to have to determine how you'll maximize the number of patients you onboard, how you're going to maximize the conversion rate so that every script that's written, that patient is able to get onto your therapy with minimal roadblocks, and how you're going to maximize patients seeing treatment through to the end. Because at the end of the day, every patient you don't find, every patient you don't onboard, and every patient you lose to discontinuation, for whatever reason, is a lost revenue opportunity. To be successful in these activities, organizations need to break through the limitations of functional barriers. They need to loop in key teams and ask questions from every angle. There are some overarching questions such as, where does our product fit in the market? What does our patient journey look like? And there are questions that are going to be critical for specific teams. For example, sales and marketing, how much will you invest in engagement activities? And when will you make those investments? For market access, how do you best respond to a claims denial? To answer these and other key questions, you need input from various teams: clinical, market access, sales, IT, and more. The answer to these questions will ultimately provide your foundation for your launch strategy and your commercial model. And this will act as your guiding light as you go through launch. Brings us to our next factor: identifying the right data sources to support your KPIs. Now, at this point, you've answered critical questions. You have input and buy-in from various functional teams, and you have a pretty good outline for your commercial model. Now you have assumptions for how your treatment will perform and what activities will take place. Now you need to identify KPIs that will help track against your anticipated results and assumptions. As you determine these KPIs, there are 3 guidelines. They are avoiding KPI overload, focusing in on key areas, and remembering that different roles will require different kinds of KPIs. So to start with, avoiding KPI overload. This can be summarized very simply. Just because you can measure something doesn't mean you should. There are so many potential metrics to consider. You want to ensure that you're avoiding this information paralysis, information overload, where you're looking at so many metrics, you don't know what to do with them. So there are a few questions here to help ensure that you do just that. First, can you explain why you're looking at a KPI? Next, are you envisioning and planning reports and dashboards with dozens and dozens of metrics, although you only really care about a handful of them? And lastly, which metrics will actually lead to an action or decision being made? Focus there. Use your assumptions on your activities, your performance, and your anticipated results to guide your focus areas. If you do this, you'll have an explanation for why you're capturing each and every metric. You'll be able to articulate what actions and decisions can be informed from looking at each KPI. As you determine your KPIs, again, remember that different teams and different levels within the organization will need different kinds of KPIs. For example, your field teams will likely look at a lot of leading indicators to measure input, and they answer the question, how am I doing? On the other side of things, your executives will look at a lot of lagging indicators and lagging KPIs, and these measure output, results over a period of time. They answer the question, did our company hit our goal this quarter? With the right balance of leading and lagging KPIs for specific roles and levels in your company, executives will be able to see the big picture, drill down as needed, and make informed decisions, whereas your field teams will be able to plan faster, bring up time to engage with customers. Now, once you've identified your KPIs, you're going to require data from multiple sources. Having the right data strategy and data technology in place is going to be critical. What data providers should you choose? Who will your CRM partner be? Does investing in claims data out of the gate make sense for your product? You may need guidance in answering these questions and in choosing the right data and data providers, partner, experience, and commercial launches. And once you identify the data and where you'll get that data from, you'll need the ability to combine it accurately into a single and unified data ecosystem. Now, whether you're considering to build out this capability internally or use an outside partner, your data and storage and aggregation technology should balance flexibility and standardization. You don't want something that's too custom so that every minute adjustment requires some custom development. But on the other side, you don't want something that's too rigid that prevents you from making urgent changes because you have to follow this long, drawn-out process. And the key takeaway here is identify your focus KPIs, identify your data needs, and then invest in a data platform that can integrate these data sources quickly, accurately, and keep up with the pace of business. Brings us to our next factor. Vinny, pass it to you.
Thank you, Joe. So to set the stage for Factor 4, I want you to imagine that you're at a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company. You've spent 5, 7, maybe 10 or more years moving a molecule from discovery all the way through the rigorous clinical trial process. Just gotten your positive phase 3 news, your top-line data, and it's time to start thinking about commercialization. For many of these companies, and as Frank mentioned, over 50% are first-time launchers in the next 3 years, you don't really have an infrastructure in place yet. And for those who are fast-tracked, you have maybe 9 months to file your NDA and launch a product. So as you think about that activity, after all of these years of development, really need a launch roadmap that plans out the next 6, 12, and 18 months to ensure that you can execute on all of the promise of all of the hard work that's gone into the clinical development. Further, many statistics indicate that a launch can be make or break in the first 6 months. So it's absolutely critical to hit the ground running. In order to do that, you need a roadmap that is going to guide your activities as you plan and then execute and adapt your commercial strategy. So what activities happen over the course of that, call it 9 months? Well, first, you're doing primary market research to understand who your patients might be, who is treating them, and where they live. You're hiring commercial executives. It's a very big decision, and you want somebody to come in with experience to, again, hit the ground running and help you commercialize that product very quickly. You're purchasing initial data. As Joe mentioned, for some products, you might want to purchase claims data to understand things like the line of therapy. For some products, many in primary care, you buy market data to really understand who's prescribing and where are orders going. You're purchasing your CRM, and you're implementing it. Sometimes you're getting that CRM up and running early so that you can have MSLs out in the field start to do disease awareness campaigns. You start to think about a commercial data warehouse. How are my users going to access the data that we do buy? You can buy all the data in the world, but if you don't have an easy way of accessing and analyzing it, you're just throwing money away. You're starting to hire your field team. Now that decision is largely informed by how many sales reps do we need? Well, that's informed by your targeting strategy. So Joe talked about those key KPIs. Who are we going after from a physician perspective? Is it the large academic hospitals, or is it community centers dispersed around the country? Are you targeting specialists who are treating a very small subset of patients, or are you targeting primary care physicians? All of that is informed by your data strategy, which leads you to how you ultimately will disperse your field team across the country. You're then starting to think about insights. So again, Joe mentioned avoiding KPI overload, but it's very important to not lose sight of the fact that you have to deliver those KPIs, those few key indicators, to the users that need them. That'll help people do their jobs day to day, removing those barriers to entry, providing physicians with the information they need to make an informed prescribing decision, and then maintaining adherence by working with patient services teams and providers, perhaps in dose titration, perhaps in side effect mitigation, whatever it may be, to ensure that you're maximizing your commercial potential. Finally, your plan is going to have to account for making modifications to the solution and whatever solutions you choose in a very agile manner, because we know things change at launch. Brings me to my next KPI here, or my next factor, tracking performance and adapting. Before I get there, though, I want to take a step back and look at the commercial data ecosystem. Joe talked a lot about having certain KPIs that are going to help you measure, track, and adapt your launch. Absolutely key, then, to pick the right partners for you. And while there are so many options across the commercial life sciences world, there are a couple of key factors as you make these decisions. The depth and the breadth of the data that you need has to match your therapeutic area. Buying, let's say, open source prescription claims data might not be very useful for a hospital care product. You might need to look at EMR. If you have a product distributed directly to hospital care settings, think of an infused product, you're probably going to use specialty distributors. But do you also want to include white bagging through specialty pharmacies to gain deeper insight into each individual referral? Do you need a patient support or copay program? Are you going to do a lot of marketing around disease awareness and prescriber education? All of these things fit into that decision that you need to make. And further, the data sources that you choose need to match your technology plan. So for example, if you plan on investing a lot of money into IT and technology solutions, you can buy a large set of open source claims data and analyze it yourself, or use a partner to do so. But if you plan on having a very lean technological infrastructure, you might choose a vendor that has what we'll call pre-aggregated trigger information. All of this is going to be dictated by what therapeutic area that you're in and what your targeting strategy is, but it all needs to fit very cleanly into the roadmap that you've developed. Otherwise, your strategy isn't going to match the technology, isn't going to match the data, and you wind up with confusion amongst teams at launch. So since we've talked about that, now really important to think about tracking performance and adapting your launch. You can have the greatest roadmap in the world that has been informed by some of the smartest people in the industry. You can have years and years of clinical evidence that lead you to believe that certain prescribers are going to prescribe a product once it's launched. You might have even done primary market research prior to a launch which has indicated that certain HCPs might be writing. But what happens when things change in the real world? Anyone that has been involved in commercial launch knows that things change rapidly. You need a partner and you need a technology strategy that enables you to change with the times and make sure that you don't fall behind your launch in that critical first 6 months, because you don't get another chance to launch a product. So what can change? Well, from a patient perspective, those points of intervention that you had anticipated might not actually be the way that prescribers are prescribing to their patients in the real world. You might have thought you're going to enter in at second line, but prescribers might be hesitant until they've tried existing second-line products. So have you been relegated to the third line, not by label, but by real-world behavior? On the payer side, are there new barriers to access that you didn't anticipate? Perhaps you'd had conversations with PBMs and payers prior to launch, and they had indicated that they'd provide a certain formulary status, maybe preferred. But then you launch and you find that you have a complex step edit and prior authorization process. How do you react to that? From the prescriber standpoint, what is the patient journey? Is it really matching what you had expected it to be? And from a distributor standpoint, are the hospitals and sites of care that you thought were going to be ordering actually ordering? Are they ordering too much? Is the supply chain robust enough to handle the demand? All of these are key factors that can contribute to a very successful or a not so successful launch. So it's very important to be able to adapt with the times. How do you do it? In our opinion, there's really 3 things that you need to keep in mind as you launch a product. And this is done through a combination of technology and expertise. 1, you need to have an agile methodology for everything that you do in launch, from data purchases to technology implementation to hiring. Perhaps you have a small sales force, and it turns out you actually need a much broader team to cover all of the community HCPs that are actually driving demand. From a second perspective, data science is becoming more and more important. I think data science for a long time has been a buzzword or an aspiration in our industry. But over the last couple of years, sometimes by choice and sometimes companies are forced to adapt to new methodologies. Think about all of what we've done during the COVID pandemic and finding new ways to reach HCPs. Digital marketing has exploded in the pharma industry. So by having all of this data at our fingertips, we now have the ability to leverage marketing data alongside claims data with prescription data, primary market research, to really apply advanced statistical methods and adapt the launch. And finally, constant recalibration, key principle to a successful launch. You can leverage real-world data to consistently refine your targeting and ensure that your sales team is reaching the right people. Now, we're not saying retarget every week, but it's very important, at least on a monthly basis, to look back at your targeting strategy, determine where it's successful, determine where it's not meeting expectations, and be able to retarget nearly on the fly. The Agile technology really enables you to do that. Final factor here is choosing the right partners. So I put up that slide before with over 100 potential data vendors and partners from the distribution side all the way through the real-world data side. When you're having these discussions with partners, and again, you really only have about 3 months to make these decisions, sometimes less after the positive top-line data, you wind up needing to onboard a lot of vendors, making a lot of investments in data. So what are some guiding principles to do that? We think there are 3. 1, technology. More than ever, technology is driving industries forward, and ours is no different. In our opinion, the technology that you choose needs to be industry-specific. It needs to be adapted to the life sciences industry. It shouldn't be something that's built for manufacturing and then slotted into life sciences, because there are so many nuances in the pharma space. It needs to be scalable. Those first-time launchers that are launching over half of the products in the next several years, they're bringing their first product to market. But they all have robust pipelines where there are many more assets behind them. For a lot of these companies that have a development pipeline, Go back to the Moderna example, but there are plenty of others. Once the technology is proven, oftentimes new indications and new molecules are rolled out very rapidly. So the technology solution needs to be able to scale quickly. It needs to be adaptive for all of those things that we talked about during the fifth principle. It needs to be secure and compliant. More than ever, there is an emphasis on data security across all technology. Our industry, more than others, is very sensitive to this given the nature of the data that we need to process. Second is process. Processes by which you implement technology as well as onboard data needs to be agile, and it needs to be built around the needs of life sciences and launch. It takes a very special set of process and team to bring to fruition that roadmap that we talked about earlier. So who is that team? Well, they need to be industry experts, and you're noticing a trend here. And in our opinion, you really need to use life sciences-specific technology and partners. They need experience with launch, but they also need to be backed by products and data science. Joe talked earlier about how in our industry, the partners that we work with and the products that are available all need to be able to pivot very quickly. So I think the most successful ones are those with a team that understands how quickly things change, has a methodology that can adapt to the constant changing needs at launch, and is backed by the technology that enables them to do so. With these principles, you'll find the right partners and be in that bucket of 50% of launchers who are successful and meet and exceed those forecasts. For a wrap-up now, I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
Thank you, Vinny, and thank you, Joe, as well. As we discussed today, the 6 key factors to launch are to start the planning process early and with the appropriate funding, to leverage a cross-functional team for a commercial model design, to identify and track the right KPIs, to build a roadmap that includes the best data and insights, to track performance and constantly adapt, and to choose the right data and analytics partners. Obviously, given the trends that we discussed around the pharma landscape, the financial investment, and the evolution of services vendors, following these steps will increase the likelihood of launch success and continue to fuel innovation. Thank you all for your interest in attending today's discussion. We saw a number of questions come in, and we'll now turn it over to start Q&A.
Great. Thank you all for those presentations. Now it's time for the Q&A. We're going to move on to the questions that came in during the presentation today. There is still time to submit your questions using that Q&A tab to the left side of your screen, but we do have a lot of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. All right, moving on to our first question here, and this question is going to be for Frank. When you talk about investing more in earlier, which commercial activities are you talking about? How much earlier, and how does it impact launch success?
Great question. So to start off, the timing of investment, tends to need to be about 2 years prior to anticipated launch. The investment amount varies. What we've seen from a lot of literature review is that it's highly correlated to the sales forecast. And I think some of the best information that we found was around something Syneos published that said that investing 75% of first-year sales into commercial planning was the magic figure, and that led to 73% of brands being successful, whereas anyone that invested less than 75%, none of those brands were successful. Now, as far as activities go, and part of the reason that the investment needs to start early, the work needs to start early, is because there's a number of activities that inherently have a sequential nature to them. And most importantly, what we see is identifying the patient journey and the standard of care but then mapping that back to your brand and understanding the efficacy benefits and the safety profile. And then bringing in factors such as dosing administration, distribution, market access really helps to answer a number of questions around where the patient is going to be diagnosed and treated, who's going to do the diagnosis and treatment, and then what alternative therapies are available. By having all of that information, the appropriate commercial model can be created that accentuates the benefits and protects against some of the potential, barriers to get access to therapy, as well as to, helping to guide the best practices in dosing, administration, and diagnosis. And those last two are really, whether there's diagnostic testing, how commonly that testing is done, how complex that testing is done. And then from the dosing and administration, we do see a lot of therapies that benefit from titration, and having that information be available, upon approval tends to be extremely valuable.
Great. Thank you for that response. All right, moving on to our next question here, and this question is going to be for Vinny. How long before a launch should you think about the planning phase roadmap that you talked about?
It's a great question, and it depends on really two things. One is the timing and confidence in early clinical results, so top-line data. There are some products that really coming out of phase 2 and based on the early phase 3 results that you see seem to be highly, highly likely to be approved. And the second is the launch forecast that Wall Street analysts publishes. I think if you've got a drug that's likely to do or predicted to do $2 billion, your timing should be slightly different than one that is projected to do, let's say, $250 million. And a lot of that is just based on cash burn and timing. So if you do have a long runway and you're well capitalized as an organization, I would say a year out from a potential launch date is when you should really start doing the planning. So oftentimes companies are forced to wait until they have that positive phase 3 news, and at that point could be 9 months out of a launch. But if you can do it early, and if you have a partner that can help you do that planning early, it really does take a lot of the pressure and stress out of a launch. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an organization think that they can onboard all of the partners required from data and technology in a 6-month to 9-month window. But in the real world, contracting takes a long time. I think in some ways the work-from-home environment that we've all been in has helped shorten some of that because folks aren't flying around the country to go to these meetings. But the earlier the better. I would say 12 months is probably ideal. I'd say 9 months you're doing okay. Once you're inside that, it becomes a little bit of a prioritization decision where you can get to a launch and you can get to a very successful launch. It's just a matter of identifying the data and the partners that you need in place on day 1 versus day 30 versus day 90 of that post-approval world.
Thank you. All right, Vinny, and this next question is for you as well. How late is too late in implementing these strategies?
That really piggybacks on the last question there where, if you're doing the planning out ahead of time, you should typically have a launch readiness state of, I'd say, 2 months prior to your PDUFA date. The FDA does seem to be approving a bit faster than it has in the past, and a lot of that is due to some of the new technological improvements put in place on the clinical side. But it's very important to know what is critical for launch. So if you go back to Joe's factor on KPIs, you've identified what your teams are going to need to be successful and what data and insights they'll require. So for example, in the specialty world, especially if somebody's using pharmacy data, You're going to have referrals for every single patient that is prescribed. Absolutely critical that field sales teams and market access teams have access to that on day one of your launch. Without that, you're not going to know where the product is in the channel, but more importantly, you're not going to know what barriers there are getting patients on therapy. So to answer the question a little bit more directly, I'd say that you should target a launch readiness date of 2 months before a launch, but you should also know what information you need at each phase of a launch. For example, you're not going to really do retargeting until a month and a half, 2 months prior to your initial launch. You probably won't have very many formularies published before 2 months, so you're probably not going to need to do very much in the market access analytics space prior to that. So if you have that launch readiness date of 2 months prior to the launch, you have your roadmap built out, and you know when certain folks on your team need certain insights, it'll really help you plan out the staggered release of a lot of these items, because it's not all at once or nothing. You can really phase in some of the insights, the information, the data that your teams need over time. And I think it's always important to recognize that it's not all or nothing. And quite frankly, if you try to release everything at once, it becomes a little bit of that KPI overload that Joe talked about. So really important to know and have the experience to know what you need and when, and that can dictate when certain elements of the technology and data need to be in place.
Thank you. All right, Vinny, here's another question for you. Everything you've outlined sounds right, but how do you know that you're doing it right?
Yeah, that's really a measurement question, huh? So I think if you think back to what we talked about from an adapting and recalibration perspective, you'll have a couple of factors that let you know what you're doing well, and you'll have a couple of factors that can be a bit ambiguous. So let me give you an example. Companies might have a goal of reaching a certain percentage of payers having their products in a preferred status. Very common market access goal. It's something that you can track through some of the syndicated payer reference data available, as well as through specialty pharmacy and claims information if you do purchase it. You can also look at your prescribers and your number of target prescribers that are writing. But back to the point about recalibration, your initial targeting might have been off. You might have a prescriber that you thought was a decile 10, high priority target, who actually happened to be speaking at a competitor's speaker bureau event, and they maybe are running trials for a competitive product. So you might have to do some recalibration there. Similarly, you can use sales as and revenue as an analog for success. But what if you have high degrees of initial adoption followed by a lot of discontinuation and attrition? So I think you really need to go back to the 3 factors that Joe talked about. Are you finding patients? Are patients able to get on therapy? And are patients adherent to treatment? And if you're doing those 3 things, even if initial prescriptions aren't as high as you think they might be, even if you have some, call it lagging indicators that show that you might be tracking a little bit behind some of those other goals, those are really 3 leading indicators for a good launch. Because if you're finding patients or finding prescribers that are treating folks that ultimately need the product that you're marketing, and I think one thing that we always have to remember is at the end of the day is really about servicing patients better in our industry. If you can do that, patients will eventually get on therapy if you have a strong market access strategy. And if you're working with the physician community to manage dose mitigation, titration in order to maximize adherence and minimize adverse events, then you're doing the right things and success will follow.
Thank you for that response. All right, moving on to our next question here. And this question is going to be for Joe. What technologies do you use?
A great question. So there are a few technologies I'd like to speak to there. First, our commercial platform is cloud-based on AWS and data agnostic in nature. Our data platform, Strata, is modular contains components dedicated for data aggregation, integration, and master data management. We have a next-generation data processing tool that speeds up ingestion of data, making it usable for our customers at a quicker pace. And lastly, our plug-and-play commercial data model makes our data more accessible for end users for analytics and data interrogation.
Thank you. All right, and Joe, this is another question for you. This all sounds great, but where do launch organizations fall short?
Right. Launch organizations have a number of pitfalls to avoid. But the two most common ones are, as Frank spoke to earlier, not investing enough money early enough as they set up for a commercial launch. As Frank spoke to, if you're not investing 75% of your forecasted revenue 2 years after launch, you're not likely to succeed. If you want to be on the right side of things, invest more earlier. The second most common pitfall is not having a cross-functional strategy or cross-functional buy-in as you build your commercial model. This be-all, end-all strategy that everyone in the organization is bought into and will work towards, that they can use as their guiding star as they look to overcome the obstacles and challenges they face during launch.
Thank you. All right, moving on to our next question here, and this question is going to be for Vinny. Vinny, you do not include commercial training in your roadmap. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when I think about commercial training, I think that there's really 2 or 3 elements to it. One is the clinical, and that is educating a sales force on the benefits of a given product. And the way that training should happen should really be based on the PA. And when you're hiring, let's say, an oncology sales force, in our experience, we generally see folks who have been oncology reps for a long time, know oncology well, and keep up with the latest and greatest news. I think a lot of times what we see is these highly educated, very intelligent reps are able to adapt their prior knowledge and, in partnership with Med Affairs, of course, to be compliant, make sure that they are delivering messaging that is really going to help prescribers make an educated decision that is in the best interest of their patients. The second factor, which I think really could have been fleshed out a little bit better on that slide, to be honest, is how do you train those people to use data and analytics to best deliver those messages? So I think to Joe's point, you can't necessarily overload people with information, but if you can educate the sales team, and that would really go into that the bucket of hiring sales team. I probably should have put hiring and training. It's really about how do you use the latest and greatest in technology to deliver key information. So for example, let's say we find in claims data that patients who take this newly launched product see another 6 months of progression-free survival versus the existing standard of care. An experienced oncology rep can deliver that message very, very well. But what might be lacking is the ability to find those physicians for whom that messaging is most appropriate. The right technology solution is going to help surface those insights very quickly to those reps. And the best technology solutions are the ones that do it effortlessly for the reps. So if they log into a dashboard, they see Dr. Smith has 4 patients that might be a candidate for this therapy. Go speak to that doctor. So I think training is an absolutely key component to any rollout of a sales force. And from a technology perspective, I really think the less training you have to do, the better off you are, because it means technology is successful in surfacing the right information to the right people at the right time.
Thank you for that response. All right, on to our next question here. What are the pros and cons of blocking specialty distributor product sales numbers that get reported to syndicated data companies during the launch phase?
Great question. This is Frank. I'll start this answer and maybe hand it over. But obviously, if data and analytics is a competitive advantage, the lack of data and analytics is also a disadvantage. So as a strategy, data blocking can be very effective, to give you an advantage and to disadvantage other folks. Now, blocking used to be something that was pretty commonly done, especially around launches, and looking at the data collection going through distributors and what I call point-of-sale systems. But with all of the advances in claims data over the last, let's call it 3 to 5 years, the impact of blocking has been muted to some degree. It still can be a very effective strategy, but needs to now take into account a lot of the market dynamics around, what competition is out there, the dosing administration reimbursement, and the accessibility to claims data that can be turned around relatively quickly to provide, to basically fill in the gaps that are created by blocking.
And I guess one thing I would add to that is the competitive dynamics of the TA that you're entering are pretty important to a blocking strategy, so whether or not you choose to do it. If you are entering a highly, highly competitive therapeutic area, think about non-small cell lung cancer, for example, and you're not necessarily confident that your adoption is going to be particularly quick, and you're worried about market cap or capitalization, it might not be a bad idea to block. It keeps the Wall Street analysts in some ways from making knee-jerk reactions based on very, very early launch predictions and information. On the other hand, as Frank said, with proliferation of claims data, let's say you've purchased a great deal of claims data. Major investments, you know that your product is projected to do blockbuster sales. It might not be a bad idea to block access to your own data and force your competitors to make the same data purchases and investments that you are, especially if you're confident in your ability to process those claims and draw better insights from them than your competition might be able to do. So in some ways, that data purchase acts as a competitive advantage, all dependent on your ability to draw useful and meaningful insights out of the data that you do buy.
Great. Thank you for that response. And that was actually the last question that we had time for today. But we did have a lot of great questions come through today and couldn't get to them all. So we will try our best to get back to everybody who submitted a question personally after the webinar. Thank you all for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Metadata Acorn AI for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using that same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.